Things are getting crazier for the Toronto Maple Leafs as former head coach Bruce Boudreau came out and proclaimed that the Toronto Maple Leafs had one of the best free agency periods and best off seasons in the NHL. We're going to break down what he said, as well as discuss a recent article that also proclaimed that the Leafs are not only going to have a better year this year than they did last year, but are going to be one of the best teams in the NHL following their free agency and off-season run. So to break all that down in this episode, but before we do, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It would mean the world to Darius and myself. But Darius, we have a lot to go over today, specifically going over a former head coach praising the Leafs, and then another article dropping also praising the Leafs. And in a time where The Athletic dropped an article just a couple days ago saying that the Leafs had the least fan confidence in the NHL in their front office, we had some other perspectives. And let's start with Bruce Boudreau. He said former NHL head coach believes Maple Leafs had most impressive offseason among Atlantic Division teams, and he added that the addition of Craig Berube will help make the Maple Leafs a tougher team to play against. And basically, he goes on to say that with all of that, the NHL's Atlantic Division remains at a standstill as the toughest division in the league. However, former NHL coach Bruce Boudreau, who appeared on the NHL Network this week, believes that Toronto had the most impressive off season. I'm going to get into his quotes in a second here, but I just want to get your thoughts on this first. A lot of negativity surrounding the Toronto Maple Leafs offseason. We've been on record saying it was pretty good, really. You got rid of Keefe. You also added some blue line things. You still need to make some changes to potentially a Nick Robertson trade and adding some more depth in the forward. But it's nice to see this from a pretty highly touted former NHL head coach in Boudreau.
Yeah, and Boudreau's had a lot of good things to say about the Leafs in recent years too, so that's really nice. And it sounds like he wants to coach for the Leafs. That's kind of what it sounds like to me. But he would be welcome, in my opinion. But I agree with him. I think the Leafs had a really good offseason, right? From the outside looking in, if you're not a fan, it might be a little puzzling. But I think Brad Living kind of went out and did everything that they needed, right? He got everything that they needed pretty cost effectively too, right? Yes, some of the older guys are signed a little longer than you'd like, but I'm sure they're going to find a way to deal with that when the time comes. So I have liked almost every move that Brad Living made this offseason. Everything made sense to me, and all his comments too along the way have made sense to me. I don't feel gaslit like I used to, right? But leading up into this point, obviously, do fans have trust is the question, right? We talked about it in a previous video just a couple of days ago. It doesn't sound like it, right? And I can't blame fans for that, but we haven't seen the product that has been put together so far this off season yet. So, I'll judge it then. But just on paper, I really like what Brad Living's put together here this off season. So I have to agree with Bruce Boudreau there. I do like everything, almost everything. All right. The Timothy Liljegren thing, I've been on the record on stream saying, a little puzzling, but almost everything I've agreed with Brad Living so far this offseason. And I think he's finally getting his hands on the team because he was kind of thrown into a tough position last year when he was hired too, just because of the timing of everything. So I think he's finally kind of getting his fingerprints on the team now.
Yeah, I agree. And you can see basically the reason he gave us, and I'm not just saying this because I'm from Toronto, but I really like what they did with their defense. I mean, the three acquisitions they made to bolster their defense, especially when you include Tanev, OEL, and of course, just everyone that they brought in this offseason has really helped. Yanni Hakanpää, maybe weird situation. When he's at his best, he's still a really good defenseman. Like, there's a lot of things to go over, and we've discussed ad nauseum the Toronto Maple Leafs blue line acquisitions. This big question mark is still what they do with Nick Robertson. It seems like Marner is here to stay, and that situation is still a little bit scary as they enter the contract year of Mitch Marner with no extension in place. But he said these guys are really good players, and Toronto already got the offense. If they can get the defense now to go with it, I really believe that they can make it past the first round. I sure hope so, and go a little bit further. And again, he's from Toronto, was drafted by the Leafs, wanted to potentially be the head coach of the Leafs before they picked Craig Berube. But it's good to see things like that. But ultimately, it's going to really rely on guys like Austin Matthews having a good year, and specifically Mitch Marner. And Mitch Marner is going to be a guy that at this point, hopefully he can have a bit of a, not a breakout year, because he's always been a close to 100-point scorer, but just have a really good season. And again, it's his contract year. He has if he goes into the playoffs again and flares out, it's going to really put big question marks on what teams are willing to give him, even though they will be willing to give him that. But any quick thoughts on that before we move on to another article that says very similar things to Bruce Boudreau?
Well, I think on the Mitch Marner front, I think there's a lot of teams that, if he were to go to free agency, are going to back up the Brinks truck for him. I think he's going to make a lot of money one way or another, whether it's in Toronto or not. But in terms of the Leafs, one thing I think that isn't a question mark is he's going to go off, barring any injuries this year, he's going to go off. I think he's going to finally get to the 100-point plateau that he hasn't been able to get to. Obviously, he got 99 points a couple of years ago, but I think he's finally going to break through that 100-point thing and have an amazing season, right? So it's going to be fun to watch. The only, bad part of it all is he's not signed yet, like you mentioned, right? So we're going to have to go through the whole season. That's kind of going to be a distraction Is he going to sign or not? We're going to have another video on that, I'm sure, that whole situation. But that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on heading into the new year too.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, that whole Mitch Marner thing is getting a little bit scary for Leafs fans. But let's go and look at this now. This is from Nick Alberga. So he said, "This is the most confident I felt about the Leafs front office in years." Alberga's take. Now, I want to bring this up again because we mentioned the Athletic article dropping. Fans voted them the least, or one of the least confident among front offices in the NHL. And Darius, I just want to get your thoughts on this and mine, of course, as well. And he basically, I'm not going to read this whole article. It's basically a rant on him saying that in terms of front office fan confidence, the Leafs placed 30th out of 32 teams and were slapped less than appetizing D grade. And then you can see here that he basically goes on. You can read the article if you want. It's an interesting read. He basically just says that he disagrees. He thinks that they had a really good offseason. He thinks that they did a very good job given the hands that they were dealt, and that they should have confidence in this front office, especially given the fact that it's a new front office. We obviously discussed this in our last video a little bit here. I think that ultimately, like, the Leafs did fine, but the reason, and I think a big part of the reason I have this lack of confidence here, is because of the lack of playoff success and the fact that they did not trade Mitch Marner, which something, if we rewind a couple months ago, when the season ended, we thought that was going to be a disappointing season if they didn't. We both changed our course on that a little bit because it makes sense. He obviously has a no move clause, so nothing got done there. But I don't know. I can see it from both perspectives here, but I think he did an okay job.
It's not just the lack of playoff success. I think they've been sitting on decisions sometimes and let them go too many years without making a decision, right? Like Mitch Marner, like you mentioned, they should have traded him last year, right? Or that's the most logical thing. Obviously, maybe you want to see it through one more year. But I think we all kind of know the answer already, right? We're going to have to go through another year of that, right? So it's going to be interesting to watch this year if they start to make, any other changes along those lines, or if they decide not to re-sign him. But I think another thing, at least for me as a fan, right, the last couple of years, is the last regime, like Kyle Dubas, and I don't want to dump on him or anything, but the last regime, the last general manager, and everyone under him, I feel like sometimes they would tell you things and kind of gaslight you into, you can't see it, but we're gonna, this player will develop the way, we see him in the NHL, right? And maybe he doesn't, he fizzles out in the AHL. So I feel like they were talking at you a lot as a fan. But this regime with Brad Treliving, say what you want about him, because obviously everyone brings up the fact that, he lost Matthew Tkachuk. He was kind of pinned into a corner there with Matthew Tkachuk as well. But with this regime, I feel like Brad Treliving, especially when the season ended, was saying things that I could see with my eyes on the ice, things that they need to address, that I can see myself and make sense, right? Is common sense. So I think I'm feeling a little bit better in that way now. Do I think they're a Stanley Cup contender? I think they're going to be up there, but I think the mental aspect of the game has to change. Maybe that's a Craig Berube thing, right? So it's going to be really interesting to watch, but I feel better, a little bit better about the transparency, at least, where I'm not being gaslit into, thinking I'm not seeing something that they are, right? I feel like with Brad Treliving, he says something and I'm like, yeah, totally. I agree. You have to upgrade the goaltending in this way, or you have to upgrade defense in this way. You have to get more puck movers, right? I can see that with my eyes. So I feel better personally in that way. I don't know how you feel, Nick, and I don't know, if people want to leave comments and how they feel that way too. But I feel like that was a huge disconnect before versus maybe this offseason.
Yeah, and everything that Treliving has said so far in the post press conference right after they lost, he's done. He said he was going to augment the defense and the goaltending. They did both. Obviously, the forward group, he remained kind of iffy on the whole Mitch Marner and Nick Robertson front. He wants Nick Robertson to stay with the team, which is also the right decision. So he did a great job for that. And looking back at the article now, he basically, Alberga says that the fact that Ottawa, Seattle, Anaheim, San Jose, Chicago, and even Kyle Dubas and the Penguins are ahead of the Leafs is a little bit mind-boggling, which it is. But again, given some track records, it kind of makes a little tiny bit of sense given the Leafs area. But let us know in the comments what your thoughts are on that as we get closer every single day to opening night for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Let us know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on all this. We'll see you soon.